Hello, and welcome back to Missouri Civil War. Today we conclude our first week of lectures with the incredible story of one Missouri man, whose tale has so many twists, turns, hopes, and disappointments that Hollywood could hardly have scripted a more compelling drama. Yet it was very real, and it led to the most notorious Supreme Court decision in American history. The case of Dred Scott versus Sanford again thrust Missouri to the forefront of national politics. The saga of Dred Scott reveals much about the lives of enslaved Missourians and their struggles for freedom within a shifting political landscape. The Supreme Court's decision was a dire moment, not only for Scott, but for all people of color, and for the fraying political harmony within the United States. And it's quite a story, so bear with me as I try to connect the dots at the main points of Dred Scott's life. Dred Scott was born a slave in Southampton County, Virginia, sometime around the year 1800. In 1830, he traveled to St. Louis, Missouri with his owner, Peter Blau. Blau then sold Scott to John Emerson. In 1833, Emerson, a surgeon for the U.S. Army, was transferred from Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis to the Rock Island Arsenal across the river in Illinois. He was then transferred to Fort Snelling in Wisconsin Territory, which is present-day Minnesota. There, Dred Scott met and married Harriet Robinson, an enslaved woman owned by another Army officer. When the Army sent Emerson to Fort Jessup in Louisiana, the Scotts followed, and sometime later gave birth to their first daughter, Eliza. After another trip to Fort Snelling, the Scotts eventually returned to St. Louis, where they welcomed the birth of another daughter, Lizzie. They remained there in the Emerson household through the doctor's death in 1843. His widow, Irene Emerson, then moved in with her father, Alexander Sanford. He hired out the Scotts to other neighboring households and collected their wages, which was common amongst Missouri households. In the meantime, Harriet Scott had begun to attend the Second Baptist African Church, where the services were led by John R. Anderson, a free man of color, who may have urged the Scotts to pursue a freedom suit, a court challenge, to petition for their freedom. Dred Scott first proposed to buy his family's freedom, but Irene Emerson refused his offer. Like her father, she worried about the legal status of the slaves if they had attempted to sell them. She worried that a prospective buyer might challenge their claim because Dred Scott and Harriet had been taken to free territory. And I'll explain the shifting legal landscape in a moment. But what we know is that on April 6, 1846, a lawyer named Francis Murdoch filed a freedom suit on behalf of Dred Scott. The claim identified Scott as a, quote, man of color, claimed as a slave, end quote, by Irene Emerson, the widow of John. During Dred Scott's early pleas for his freedom, Irene's brother, Alexander Sanford, joined the St. Louis Anti-Abolitionist Society, which looked upon the growing population of free blacks within St. Louis with wariness. They looked upon them with increased vigilance because they see this free black population as a danger. They see that it's encouraging slaves like the Scotts to demand their freedom. They're worrying that these increased contacts were behind these freedom suits. And I want to offer just a bit of context about how St. Louis is changing. I'd said before that this is a period of incredible population growth. From 1840 to 1850, the number of free people of color in St. Louis has nearly tripled. It's gone from 500 to about 1,400. But that growth hardly kept pace with the city's overall development, and the proportion of free blacks actually declined. That trend is even more pronounced for the slave population, which is increasing in real numbers, but as a percentage of the total population, slaves went from being 9% to just under 3%. And so the city is growing by leaps and bounds, and even as it seems that blacks are a smaller and smaller proportion, the anxieties of slaveholders are growing too, and that's the most important point to keep in mind. Lawyer Francis Murdoch left Missouri for California, like so many others, going out there seeking their fortune in the gold rush after 1849. And when he left, an attorney named Charles Drake assumed responsibility for preparing Dred Scott's legal case. At this point, the Blau family, the Blaus who had been Dred Scott's original owners, they sensed the pro-slavery determination of the Sanfords to resist Scott's suit, and they now intervene on behalf of their former slave. The key figure here was Charlotte Blau, Peter's daughter. Dred Scott's first trial in Missouri did not change his status as a slave. The trial judge noted that the Scotts had worked as wage earners during the period when they'd been hired out, and that they had failed to prove their status as slaves. And so they lost on a technicality. Irene Emerson then put the Scotts under the custody of the St. Louis County Sheriff, where they would stay through 1857. And how this arrangement worked was that the sheriff would hire them out and collect the Scotts' wages and return the wages to Mrs. Emerson. The Scotts were granted a new trial in circuit court, which they won in January 1850. The next month, the Emersons appealed this decision to the Missouri Supreme Court, and this appeal happens as the sectional tensions over slavery are mounting. Remember the last video when I talked about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and you just have this division that's growing. Prior to the Scotts' appeal, Missouri voters had just turned out 2 of the pro-slavery judges on the Missouri Supreme Court, which seemed an auspicious sign. Nevertheless, by a 2-to-1 majority, the Missouri Supreme Court overturned the trial judge who had given Dred Scott his freedom. The court declared, quote, "Times now are not as they were when the former decisions on the subject were made." The dissenting judge in that case, Hamilton Gamble, will resurface in our class very soon, as will Scott's attorney, Charles Drake. The case then moved from state courts to federal courts, as Dred Scott sued Irene Emerson's brother and her legal representative, John Sanford, who was a resident of another state, New York. And the Sanfords will urge the district court to dismiss the case because Scott, in their argument, was a slave and thus not a citizen who had no standing to bring the case. The federal district court deferred to the ruling of the Missouri Supreme Court, and Montgomery Blair, a Missourian who had moved his law office from St. Louis to Washington, D.C., and now represented Dred Scott in this final phase of the saga, he appealed, arguing this case before the United States Supreme Court. But before we finish with what the Supreme Court says, let's step back just to explain how this legal landscape in Missouri has shifted before Dred Scott's eyes. In the 1824 case of Winnie versus Whitesides, which had also come out of St. Louis, the St. Louis Circuit Court declared that Winnie, a slave, was now free because she had for a time resided in Illinois Territory back in 1799, and so she was free. Upon appeal, the Missouri Supreme Court agreed, ruling that once a person had become free by traveling and residing in free territory, that person was thenceforth free, even after they returned to Missouri or a slave state. That court cited the Northwest Ordinance passed by Congress in the 1780s, which had forbidden slavery in the Northwest Territory. It also cited the Comity Clause and the Fugitive Slave Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And in addition, the Missouri Supreme Court noted that judges in both Mississippi and Kentucky had ruled similarly upon these freedom suits during the previous 6 years. In the years that followed Winnie versus Whiteside, there emerged a substantial number of freedom suits, most of them in St. Louis, in which more than 60 former slaves gained their freedom. Winnie versus Whitesides remained the controlling legal precedent through 1846 when Dred and Harriet Scott had filed their freedom petitions. Remember, St. Louis is a city undergoing rapid changes. It had a burgeoning population of German immigrants, most of whom were opposed to slavery. In many ways, though, pro-slavery forces still controlled the balance of power in the city. The Scott's case began as a straightforward freedom suit, with nothing to suggest that it was going to become this national bombshell. Most of these suits had proven successful. But by the time their case slowly wended its way through state and then federal courts, the national context has shifted. And so let's look at the U.S. Supreme Court. James Buchanan, a Northern Democrat, was inaugurated as president in March 1857. Buchanan hoped that perhaps the U.S. Supreme Court might offer clarity to this worsening sectional crisis over slavery. And 3 days after he became president, the court did indeed issue a monumental ruling. And by this time, the case of Dred Scott has attracted national attention. This becomes the case. And in it, the Supreme Court majority ruled against Scott. First, as a person of color, the court said that Dred Scott was not a citizen and thus had no right to use the federal courts. Chief Justice Roger Taney, speaking for the majority, said that blacks, quote, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, end quote. Because blacks had different ancestors and lacked a heritage of freedom, he said, they could never join the nation's political family. As a result, the court ruled that Dred Scott remained a slave. Illinois state law had no effect upon Scott once he returned to Missouri. Then, in regards to Scott's trip into the Wisconsin Territory, and this was the most stunning part of the ruling, Justice Taney declared that Congress had no constitutional power to bar slavery from Wisconsin Territory or any of the Louisiana Purchase. In effect, that Missouri Compromise was null and void from the beginning, meaning that Scott had no claim to freedom by traveling through or residing in lands governed by that law. In effect, any federal law that interfered with Southerners' rights to bring slave property into the territories, such laws were illegal. The decision effectively made unconstitutional the platform of the new Republican Party, which called upon Congress to restrict slavery in the federal territories. In the North, the Dred Scott decision sank the reputation of the Supreme Court, which many now regarded as beholden to a slave power conspiracy that controlled all three branches of the federal government. The conclusion to Dred Scott's saga came on May 26, 1857, when the Scott family finally secured its freedom. The second husband of Irene Emerson, Calvin Chaffee, had become a Republican representative from Massachusetts, and his new wife's slave-owning status was a professional liability and a political embarrassment. Chaffee was opposed to slavery, and he worked quietly with the politically powerful family of Frank Blair in St. Louis to provide for the Scotts' manumission. Mrs. Irene Chaffee, though, insisted upon collecting the back wages earned by the Scotts, which the St. Louis sheriff had kept, and these wages amounted to nearly $750. Dred Scott died on September 17, 1858, and his body was laid to rest in Wesleyan Cemetery. Harriet Scott would live in St. Louis, working as a laundress until her death in 1876. Although the Scotts belatedly became free, the Supreme Court's decision hardened the boundaries of freedom in Missouri and all of America. In short, whiteness meant freedom and citizenship. Blackness meant something less. Nationally, the case had not settled the slavery question, as President Buchanan had hoped, inasmuch as it deepened the split between North and South. Next week, we look at that split and how the elections of 1860 brought Missouri and the nation to the brink of civil war. Until then.